Is the US's patronage of Rwanda ensuring many more years of conflict and death in the Democratic Republic of Congo? And after our program on how Ecuador's indigenous community is fighting back against Chevron, the oil giant responds. You're watching Inside Story, Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Ratansi. Rebels in the eastern DRC say they have begun withdrawing from territory they captured from government troops. About 500,000 people have fled their homes during 7 months of fighting. The violence has been particularly disturbing, coming less than 10 years after the end of the Congo War that killed some 5.4 million people. The US dispatched a State Department official to the region, but has been careful to spare its allies anything beyond symbolic sanction, even after a UN report concluded that Rwanda and Uganda are backing the M23 rebels. Rwanda's President Paul Kagame in particular has been cultivated as a staunch US ally. Bill Clinton once called him, quote, one of the greatest leaders of our time, end quote. And US companies like Starbucks have invested heavily in the country. Rwanda's alleged involvement with Congo's M23 rebels notwithstanding, critics say Kagame runs an authoritarian state with a terrible human rights record. When Kagame won the 2010 election with 93% of the vote, the 3 main opposition parties were excluded from the ballot and 2 of their leaders were jailed. Similarly, Yoweri Museveni's Ugandan government has received US support even after a US State Department report accused the country of gross human rights violations. Kampala, too, is accused of destabilizing its resource-rich neighbor to the west, the DRC. So what's driving US policy towards the latest conflict in the DRC? I'm joined in the studio by Kambala Musavuli, a national spokesman for Friends of the Congo. Also here, Nia Quetta, an African policy analyst and former executive director for Africa Action. And from Houston, we're joined by Herman Cohen, who served as Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs under George W. Bush. The most useful thing to do, perhaps, is to try and, first of all, establish what Rwanda's role is in this current conflict. And we have this UN report by its group of experts that was released publicly last week. These are some of the main findings. It says troops from both Rwanda and Uganda have helped the M23 expand control of territory in the eastern part of the DRC. That Rwanda helped recruit soldiers for M23 leader Bosco Ntaganda, who is leading rebel troops on the ground. He's also wanted by the International Criminal Court for alleged war crimes. UN investigators interviewed rebel soldiers who said they were Rwandans sent across the border to join the fighting. The report also says traders in Rwanda are funding the conflict thanks to money from tin, tungsten and tantalum smuggled across the border from mines in the eastern DRC. An interim report was leaked to the media this summer, and the US was accused of blocking its release. Now, clearly, Rwanda has fought back against this report, but, Ambassador, is there any reason to doubt the credibility of the UN group of experts?
Well, I listened to my own government, the United States, and they've said that the UN report is credible, so I would agree with them.
And would everyone else concur with that here in the studio?
Yes, I mean, it's not only corroborated by the group of experts, but we also have the intelligence sources within the region and SADC nation who had independent investigation on the issue, and they came up with the same conclusion, that Rwanda is in fact supporting rebel groups in the Congo and using their troops to come in to support them as well.
All right, well our reporter in the region, Peter Grester, talked to Paul Kagame about the report. This was Kagame's response to the allegations.
It is a fictitious report. When you keep talking about a report, I don't understand the report. Do these people even need weapons? They've been deserting with weapons. They are coming from government forces and moving with weapons. I don't have to give anybody weapons. It doesn't make sense. Secondly, this so-called rebellion, in fact, stands for nothing for us. If somebody just tried to think reasonably, what would Rwanda be looking for in this mess? Previously, we are working with the government. We are doing what we needed to do with the authorization, working together. What else would we be looking for?
Clearly, Kinshasa has very little control and has been apparently been losing control
I
over
should
the
not
years.
be accused of that. This is what I'm saying.
No, no, I'm not saying that you are.
That's what we are accused of.
No, no,
We
just-
should
just-
not,
well,
we
let
should
me
not
finish my
be
question.
accused of a mess in the DRC, period.
So what about that knee? I mean, you know, this is all circumstantial. There might be some connection, but it's not government policy. Clearly, Rwanda does have an interest in some of the Rwandan rebels who are still being harbored, or still have bases in the DRC. And anyway, it's true that perhaps the Congolese government did renege on some of its promises to the rebels. I mean, this is a DRC problem, actually.
There's no question that the DRC has a role, and that the DRC government is not anybody's idea of the perfect, well-controlled government. But I think Paul Kagame's denials fly in the face of the evidence. If you listen to him carefully, everybody in the world is wrong. The UN is wrong, its own allies, the UK, and the United States. As the ambassador mentioned, the U.S. finds their reports credible. And this is only this year's report. We must remember that in 2010, we had the larger mapping report. So the record of Rwanda meddling in the DRC is long and credible, but the President Kagame, always denies that in the face of evidence.
All right, well, having established that then, Ambassador Cohen, this does then bring up the US's role too, Paul Kagame. Earlier in the year, though, Susan Rice, the UN ambassador, was accused of trying to prevent this report from being released. And certainly in the past, the US has seemed to be loath to criticize Rwanda. How would you characterize their relationship?
I think the relationship is very close, but it's starting to separate a little bit. The United States has a great deal of respect for Rwanda for several reasons. They have sent troops to work with the UN in Darfur. This is a very important contribution. Rwanda's military and the American military are very close, and Rwanda cooperates with intelligence gathering against extremist forces, jihadists in the region, and what have you. And Rwanda always supports American foreign policy in the United Nations and everywhere else. Plus, you have the element of genocide guilt. Under the Clinton administration, the United States did nothing to stop the genocide. So ever since then, there's been a reluctance, sort of a guilt feeling, do not criticize Rwanda. But as I said at the beginning, this is beginning to fray, because the Eastern Congo is a tremendous humanitarian disaster, with all of these warlords and foreign governments and the Congolese governments doing terrible things to the people there.
But are you seeing any evidence of that, Kambale, that I mean, this time Ambassador or Secretary of State, Assistant Secretary of State Johnny Carson has said some rather tough things about Rwanda. About $200,000 in aid was prevented from going that way, which is hardly anything but symbolic, at least.
Yes.
So are we seeing perhaps even a split in the administration? Because Ambassador Rice, at the very least, doesn't seem to be as forthright as some of the other members of the administration. What do you make of it?
It's almost as a repeat of the 1994 genocide, where there was a split within the government around how to deal with the issue there. But as a Congolese, I'm looking at it, this has been going on for 16 years. There are those who want to stop it and those who wanted to keep it as business as usual. But it's really not up to the U.S. government to change it. It's really up to the American people. I'm very clear of that. The pressure has to be kept up to put pressure on Susan Rice at the Security Council to have tough sanctions.
But should we be personalizing it like this? I mean, this is one of those questions. Actually, whenever we talk about Rwanda and Paul Kagame, it's very striking the personal warmth you often see between American officials or Tony Blair or Bill Clinton, Susan Rice, with Paul Kagame himself. I mean, it seems ridiculous in some ways to talk about geopolitics in the, by individualizing it. But I mean, is there some sort of strange aspect to it?
I think there is, and I would say that it's counterproductive, because this personal relationship built about one person, and especially a person who we know is autocratic. I mean, I think the thing that we have to factor in is how dictatorial Paul Kagame is inside Rwanda. I also want to step back a bit and talk about, this is a pattern of U.S. support of strong men in Africa. It's gone on ever since Africa became independent for 50 years, and especially if we are talking about the Great Lakes. Rwanda, in terms of size, is a tiny speck compared to the Congo. The question is, why is the Congo so weak? I, for one, think it's because the U.S. was in bed for Mobutu for close to over 30 years. And this embrace of dictatorial strong men in Africa, I think is bad for Africa and it's bad for the United States.
Especially Susan Rice, for example, I mean, she's so forthright about the responsibility to protect and liberal interventionism elsewhere when terrible human rights abuses are going on. What's preventing those principles from being applied to Rwanda and Paul Kagame?
Here I think I agree with Kambale very much. I think it's because U.S. policy officials don't feel any heat from the American people. I think America's greatest strength is its own democracy and openness. And yet, in its foreign relations, especially in Africa, but not just in Africa, the Middle East, Latin America a while ago, they are so comfortable with dictators. And I think unless the activists and the American citizenry push and say we have no business propping up dictators who stir up war, who kill people, no matter whether we think they are effective or efficient like Paul Kagame, that has to change, because it comes back to bite the United States too.
But there's another argument that we hear, Ambassador, though, that, okay, perhaps Paul Kagame is partly the cause of this crisis, but he can also be part of the solution. In the interest of conflict resolution, there's no reason to start grandstanding against him. He can be now a mediator. If that is the role that he now takes, and he does tend to win these, you know, when he's confronted with these situations, he does tend to come out on top. What would he want? What does Rwanda want out of this current crisis, do you think?
I think we have to remember that Rwanda has effectively controlled Kivu since its first invasion there in 1996. So from 1996 to 2002, Rwanda was the sovereign in Kivu. So they developed business relationships, commercial relationships, political relationships. People moved from Rwanda to Kivu to start farms and pastoral occupations. So all of a sudden, President Kabila of Congo says, I want you out now. He can't just kick them out because they've been running the place for all this time. So I think what Kagame is really looking for, and what I'm recommending, is an economic common market between Rwanda and the Kivus and the Ituri province, which means that all of this underground movement, this pillage that's going on now, can become regularized, and both the Congo and Rwanda could earn wealth from this. When I recommend this to Congolese, they always say, oh, you just want the breakup of the Congo. Well, I tell them it is already broken up. Kivu belongs to Rwanda. It does not belong to the Congo.
And Kambale, at this point, we should also point out the enormous business interests and the mineral wealth of this region. Actually, I mean, just very quickly, I mean, how much control, how much cooperation is there between U.S. multinationals, U.S. business interests, and this region, as far as we know, there?
I mean, it's very apparent. Many companies do businesses there. And this happens because of the diplomatic cover of the U.S. Given the U.S. has a clean, or at least present a clean relationship with Rwanda, Rwanda becomes the miracle, the economic miracle that exists, and it attracts more businesses.
Where does it get all this money, by the way, actually, from?
40% of Rwanda's budget is international donors.
Right.
And then the investment of some of the companies who are operating there, they're coming there to pretty much exploit. Some of them are actually getting resources from the Congo. From
Kivu
We had cases, for example, Eagle Wing Resources, which had offices in Kigali, which was also getting resources out of the Congo. In the 2002 UN report, it speaks about Eagle Wing's resources.
So is Rwanda now the main transshipment? Is that the main transshipment?
Rwanda and Uganda are the conduit of Congo's
all this mineral wealth.
Yes, it goes through Kigali.
There's no other way to get it out.
Right. Yeah. And so which U.S. companies are involved? Name some names. I mean, that might help.
There are quite a few U.S. companies, and some of them are in the East. So, for example, in the last report, they did not mention a U.S. company. They actually mentioned a gold company that's using small traders, Machanga Ltd. In 2002, there is a list of 85 U.S. companies, a few names: Cabot Corporation, which now is operating in Katanga. You have Kemet Electronics, you have Vishay, and the list is there. The thing is that there is no accountability for them. When you contact the State Department points of contact around sanctions on those companies that were listed by the UN in 2002, they haven't done anything around those companies. So there is that culture of impunity that continues where we know the perpetrator in terms of the companies, individuals, and countries, and nothing is done.
So, Nia, when the State Department looks at this region, Ambassador Cohen's been talking about a common market, as he says, for years. But we know that this administration looks at the region through the prism of the war on terror, geostrategic interest, and also multinational exploitation. Do you find that these sort of ideas, as we talk about possible conflict resolution, may now come back into vogue? And what impact and what significance would that have for the DRC? And what could Kabila even do, actually?
I think this is why, you know, with all due respect, I'm skeptical of the ambassador's proposal, because I think basically it will reward Rwanda's long-term bad behavior. I mean,
that's realpolitik, they'll say.
Well, yes, but then you have to look at what example does that set. The Congo is a big country, you know, and what will happen in other parts of the country, what will happen in other parts of Africa where big countries look on their smaller neighbors as they may have resources that they may want when you get disputes. I think Rwanda should not be rewarded. I think the U.S. should put down its foot. And, you know, President Obama has made, for me, some very interesting arguments about authoritarian development being, you know, short-sighted. What we have in Rwanda is authoritarian development.
Before he was president, though.
I'm sorry?
Wasn't that before he was president?
Oh, no. In fact, you know, when he went to Indonesia, when he went to Russia, and even his speech in Ghana, and when you look at the new revised strategic paper for his Africa policy, I think the problem is its implementation, because it makes clear that democracy is important.
Right, and even if the war on terror is raging, even if you got Rwanda there as a bulwark to do whatever you want, I mean, you really see those principled interests trumping these interests.
I do, because I actually think the rule of Paul Kagame, while he may have succeeded in the past couple of decades, is actually building up steam.
Right.
You know, what led to the genocide?
Against him.
Yes,
right.
Against him, and it may not happen during his term. But the U.S. clearly says that the best way to fight terrorism and the conditions that create terrorists is democracy. We are allowing Paul Kagame to run an authoritarian government inside Rwanda and then to go over the border and wreak havoc and covet the wealth of the Congo. I think if you let him get away with that, right, you are really setting in train a very bad policy. So I'm against the idea.
Kambala, as you say, though, I mean, Kagame's been in this position countless times before, since the 90s, but he always comes out on top. But if he stops becoming useful, if there is this head of steam behind him trying to get rid of him, then surely then the U.S. will start thinking, hang on, perhaps we need someone else. I mean, it might not be democracy, but I mean, do you get that sense?
Well, this is what we're seeing in Egypt. I don't think that we have to look at it in the prism of what the U.S. wants, right? Is that it's inevitable that Paul Kagame will not be in power.
But domestically, though, I mean, it is a success story, isn't it? There is, great literacy and education and healthcare.
It's because of what we are told by Bill Clinton and Tony Blair. This is not what the average Rwandan is saying in their country. They are suffering. Right? We have people who are living in poverty, while the West says that Rwanda is actually a rich country. We have people who are in prison. Like, for example, the genocide survivor, Deo Mushahidi, who is a political prisoner, Victoire Ingabire, who is also there, Bernard Tanganda. Those people are trying to have a new Rwanda. They are not supported, and they are sidelined while the West stays silent. So we know that Rwanda is a ticking bomb. What we're saying is, we've seen the signs forever. We see that in going through the timeline. 97, Garrison report documenting Rwanda's troops massacring civilians in Tingi-Tingi in Congo. We see in 2002 where they listed the names of individuals and companies at the UN. We saw in 2008, Sweden and Netherlands actually got engaged when the UN report was published showing Rwanda's complicity in the Congo. They put some pressure, and the US didn't follow suit during that time. 2010, Akwete just shared about the UN Mapping Exercise report, showing again the culture of impunity. We are now here in 2012. We are again dealing with a report that shows that Rwanda is implicated in the Congo. I argue, because of the culture of impunity, this is what is causing millions of deaths in the Congo. If it's shifted, we have a chance at peace, not just for the Congo, but for the region.
Kambala Musavulu, thank you very much. Akwete, as always, thank you. Ambassador Herman Cohen, thank you very much too.
You're welcome.
Now, on the last edition of Inside Story Americas, we examined the case Ecuador's indigenous communities have brought against Chevron. Nearly 2 years ago, an Ecuadorian judge ruled that the oil giant was liable for decades of environmental destruction in Ecuador's Amazonian territory. But Chevron still refuses to pay more than $18 billion in damages. This week, a Canadian court is considering whether to enforce the ruling. A lawyer for Chevron has now told us that the entire case against the company is fraudulent.
My response is, watching your broadcast last night and seeing those gentlemen talk about these issues really gives environmentalism a bad name. They were really restating the false, fraudulent statements that their legal team has stated in court in Ecuador, in courts in the United States. At least 7 U.S. courts have found that fraud tainted those Ecuadorian proceedings. All the evidence they talked about that they supposedly had is fake. The reports that they submitted that were submitted by a supposed independent expert, the plaintiff's lawyers secretly ghost-wrote the reports. They ghost-wrote the judgment, the $19 billion judgment they were talking about. And you don't have to take my evidence for this. We were able to get outtakes from a movie called Crude, where we have them in living color, HD video, conspiring with the supposed court-appointed expert, engaging in all sorts of improper conduct, saying they're going to pressure the courts, intimidate the courts, that the courts are corrupt. It's really an outrageous global scam that they're perpetrating, and it's not good for the Ecuadorian people. It's terrible for global commerce. It's really an outrage, so I really appreciate being on here today to talk about it.
So it's incontrovertible, though, that Texaco left behind an environmental wasteland. So your tactic then is simply to turn this on the rambunctiousness of the lead lawyer, is that correct?
That's not correct on 2 fronts. One, Texaco, which left Ecuador in the 1990s pursuant to an agreement, a settlement agreement with the government of Ecuador, which released Texaco from all liability. Texaco cleaned up, remediated the sites that it was required to clean up. The government of Ecuador released Texaco from any liability. The government of Ecuador for the last 20 years has continued to extract oil. So if anyone's responsible for what's going on in Ecuador today, it's the government of Ecuador. The plaintiffs' lawyers have not sued Ecuador because they're colluding with the government of Ecuador. But this is all a scam. They have made up the evidence. They've fabricated expert reports. They've engaged in a terrible fraud. And it's not just our targeting the lawyer. They are making things up. The other thing that I noticed last night is that the people you had on suggested they were out for the good of the people and for the good of the environment. We had access to all their internal files, the lawyers' files. When we exposed this fraud, they said we could go to jail. They could go to jail, the lawyers. They knew that this was a fraud, number one. And number two, nothing in their files suggested they were going to send money to the people of Ecuador to try to clean up in Ecuador. It was going to go into their pockets, offshore accounts. They were going to keep the money out of Ecuador. It's outrageous, and it really does give environmentalism a bad name. There are good people out there who want to clean up the environment. Chevron is a socially responsible company. What these lawyers are doing is fraudulent. It's a racketeering scheme. We have a racketeering lawsuit pending in New York. We're going to pursue this and get justice in this case. And if there's going to be a resolution, it would be with the government of Ecuador. We're willing to sit down with Ecuador. Chevron's willing to sit down with Ecuador. They've rebuffed us so far. But what they're doing is making up facts, making up supposed science, and it's a fraud.
But Texaco did pump in 18 billion gallons of toxic water into 900 unlined pits, which they decided it was too expensive to line them to prevent the seepage into the environment. 17 million gallons of oil. As a socially responsible company, can Chevron, which now owns Texaco, walk away from that, even if they say, well, look, we did our bit and it was certified by the government of the time?
That's another false fact. Again, you're just, I know you talked to them last night and they made those points. That's just false. The groundwater, the production did not pump all those gallons of oil into the water. The plaintiffs' own experts, when they tried to get them, when the lawyers tried to get their experts, the people they hired to say those things, the experts said, we can't say that. That's false. And so they fired those experts and then blackmailed a judge in Ecuador to appoint this so-called independent expert who they funneled bribes to.
One keeps coming back, though, to that statement from that lobbyist, the Chevron lobbyist in 2008 to Newsweek. If we let little countries like Ecuador screw around with big companies like Chevron, I mean, this would be a terrible precedent to set. I mean, is that the point? I mean, the principle here would be too great. I mean, there is an environmental wasteland down there. There's no way this is going to be allowed to stand.
Chevron disagrees with the statement that you're quoting. The rule of law is important, and environmental care and taking care of the environment is important. Chevron was never doing business in Ecuador. Texaco did what it was supposed to do. If there were issues with that, with the remediation, as I said, Chevron today would sit down with Ecuador and talk about it. Ecuador has estimated the remediation would be something like $70 million for the areas they were supposed to take care of, not tens of billions of dollars. But this kind of shakedown scam that's being perpetrated by these lawyers who want to line their own pockets at the expense of the Ecuadorian people is not the way to do it.
And you can log on to our website to see both the complete interview with Chevron's lawyer, that should be posted in the coming days, as well as our full discussion of the merits of the case. But that's it from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.